Welcome to The Fifth Element, a podcast for language educators who want to bridge theory and practice with a strong science-based foundation. Language teaching has long been shaped by the four skills, but what if there's something more? What if the future of language education requires a fifth element? In this podcast, we challenge established ideas, explore new perspectives, and push the boundaries of what effective language teaching should look like. I'm Yasinka, and today we have the privilege of speaking to Dr. Jelena O'Reilly. As a researcher in second language acquisition and an advocate for mental health in academia, Dr. O'Reilly brings a unique perspective into how we learn, how we teach, and where education might be getting things wrong. We'll be tackling some of the most controversial topics in language pedagogy, from the role of explicit grammar instruction to whether learner autonomy really works in the classroom. But before we get into that, let's start with her own journey about how she went from teaching English in Croatia to becoming a leading researcher in the UK. Let's get started. Okay, so let's get the show on the road then. So, Jelena, what does a Croat do in York, actually? So I would like to start off by asking you about your journey from teaching English in Croatia to doing research, so applied linguistics research in the UK. So it's quite inspiring to see how much you have already done. I'm just curious about what sparked your shift from teaching practice to applied linguistics research.
Hi. Well, thank you so much for having me. This is my first podcast ever, so very exciting. I was primarily educated to be a teacher of English. I spent about 8 years teaching English as a foreign language in a foreign language school in Zagreb called Eureka at the time. And I was teaching people of all ages and different types of courses, from like general English to English for academic purposes, for business English, for legal English purposes. And one of the things that I was teaching was also preparation course for IELTS, which is you either need a high IELTS score to be a court interpreter, or you need it for studying abroad. And I was regularly teaching amazing students who had like extremely high English proficiency, amazingly so. But when I was, for example, correcting their essays, one of the main things I always had to correct was English articles. So cat or the cat. And after a few years of doing that, I was like, why are these people who are so amazingly good at English so bad at articles? Why am I always correcting articles specifically? So I became very interested in that. And I started kind of doing a bit more reading on the side to try and understand it, realized it was a very complex issue, and then thought to myself, well, why don't I actually go and properly investigate that by doing a PhD? And I knew I wanted to be in the UK because I wanted to be in an English-speaking country and I didn't want to go to the US. And I found one of the leading researchers in article research. She was in York. So I packed up my things and followed her and did my PhD.
Oh, so that sounds really, really interesting and really awe-inspiring to actually have a researcher to actually admire that much. As students, I think that it's every researcher's dream to have young students who are actually inspired by them, right?
Yeah. Hopefully that's how she felt as well.
Okay, great. So York, right? So if you could actually maybe say a few words about the place where you currently teach and what you actually teach, so that would be great.
So I work at the University of York as a lecturer, or I think in Europe they're called assistant professors, and I teach a lot of stuff. I'm within the Department of Education, and we have a lot of different research strands and focuses. So I primarily either teach things like psychology in education, which would be more about how children develop their reading ability, how students differ in personality and intelligence and different things, and how does this affect their education. And then I also teach more kind of applied linguistics, language modules such as English linguistics or teaching English to speakers of other languages. And yeah, so a mix of everything.
Okay. I'm really curious about a lot of those courses, but let's go back to your PhD.
Mm-hmm.
So why can't Croats actually acquire articles as well as you would actually expect them to be able to? Okay, so your PhD actually focused on how learners process and produce articles, right? So you will correct me if I did not actually specify that well enough, and what actually you think every language teacher or every language learner should know about what you found.
So my assumption going into the PhD, my hypothesis was that people who don't have articles in their first language, in their native language, will not have anything to positively transfer into their learning of the second language. So if you're thinking about the kind of the brain as a network and the language is a network, if you have things, if you already have a network in your native language, right, then that's a very entrenched, deeply developed network that you have been using for years. And now comes this new network, and some things are similar, so then it draws from that, and some things are different. And let's say in Croatian, when you say daj mi tu šalicu, daj mi šalicu, we will be able to perform that request without an article, right? So the article does not always have a practical function. Sometimes it needs to be there syntactically, but there's not a real need for it. So in your second language, where your brain is already using up so much resources, it's very often very, very easy to just simply go for the Croatian version and just say, give me cup, or give me mug, than to actually, bother to add this very often unnecessary tiny little word that makes no difference at all to understanding of the sentence, right? The problem with English is that sometimes the article is not necessary, and sometimes it is. Sometimes it has a function. So English articles are super, super complex. And, obviously Croats, especially at high proficiency, will learn a lot of the rules about articles, but not all of them. And generally my PhD indicates that when the first language does not have a structure, and especially when it's very complex in the second language, then mistakes are more likely to happen. And you might actually say, well, that's really depressing. Does it really then mean that Croats will never reach, a certain level of proficiency? No, actually it doesn't. I think it really frees people up, meaning that, you can't be perfect in a second language. You can't even be perfect in a first language. Perfect. So it kind of removes a lot of the pressure that second language learners feel to be perfect in the second language. It's actually not possible and it's not needed.
So, for a language teacher, what would be the most important thing then? So this is for language learners, in a sense, quite a relief to say, okay, so there is quite a big gap between the language that you know as your L1 and the language that you're trying to acquire, meaning that you will actually need to practice and you will need time and effort invested in those articles. What about teachers? So you said yourself that you were actually struggling to understand. So why can't they just learn, or why do I actually even have to explain that they need to hear, right? So they need to hear the way that we actually use articles, right?
Sorry, Jasenka, you froze completely.
I did.
Yeah, sorry, I missed the last bit after I stopped talking.
That's okay. I can repeat. Is it okay now?
It's okay. Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. So okay. So we know. So I'll just rephrase because I was just going around my own thoughts. So language learners can actually be instructed in how to use articles, but what about teachers? What do they need to know about how, let's say, L1 Croats acquire articles?
I think for teaching articles, first of all, the majority of materials for teaching English as a foreign language that I've ever worked with, they don't actually teach articles adequately, in my opinion. So people actually do get quite a limited exposure to kind of explicit article instruction. Like with most things with teachers, I would suggest that they actually do draw the learner's attention to articles, but only in situations where the article affects the meaning of the sentence. Because I think these kind of little article omissions from time to time, they don't really impede communication. We don't need perfect communication. Even native speakers make mistakes and they're not capable of perfect communication. So I would personally focus on instances when the article actually does matter and try and draw the learner's conscious attention to those instances, especially in written and oral production.
Amazing. Okay. So this actually brings us to another, let's say, broad topic, and that is grammar instruction, right? So it is actually still one of the most debated topics in language teaching. And I was just curious about what you thought about, should language teachers really explicitly teach grammar at all? Okay. Or is it about time to completely abandon explicit grammar teaching and focus on, let's say, some kind of input-driven approach?
I'm firmly in the explicit teaching camp.
Okay, that's brave.
That doesn't mean that the way it's explicitly taught now or has been in the last 10, 15 years, that it's good.
Yeah.
But the problem with input-driven is great. But you need a tremendous amount of input for things to actually stick. So the brain can only draw from input if there is enough input. And my kind of 2 cents is that a few hours in school cannot be enough input. Input-driven works only in immersion settings as a primary method because the amount of input is high enough to actually result in anything. But even in immersion settings, there is still room for explicit teaching of grammar. But explicit teaching of grammar in school contexts has very often, and even in the UK, it turns into standardized testing or testing in general. And the purpose of a language is not to be tested, it's to be used, either in written or spoken form. So, if you are going to use explicit teaching of grammar, that needs to be then translated into practice, because otherwise it always remains simply rule-based and explicit, and it works well for testing, but doesn't work well for real life. So when I was teaching English, especially with adults, who come in the evening for an hour using their precious time to learn English, I would explicitly teach them grammar. But then I would have exercises where we would use that specific, like let's say we're learning past simple, then I would have exercises that would force the learners to use past simple in speaking. So then you get the explicit, then you can see the benefit of explicit instruction.
How about post-task grammar focus? In a sense that you do not actually focus on the form while you're reading a text or while you are discussing about a topic of your choice. You get to a point where you actually focus on the grammar part, so on the form, post-task. How about that? Does that actually make any sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. That, I think, would have a lot of application in language teaching. I think the main problem, is that we generally tend to see things in language teaching as binary. It's either this or it's that. And in my opinion, it's drawing on all of them in varied amounts when it's appropriate. So I think essentially, maybe I'm jumping to a later question, but if you want to equip a teacher with good techniques and ways of teaching, it's not this approach or that approach, it's all of the approaches, but getting them to understand when it's appropriate to use one approach over the other. And then you're essentially giving them like a little bag of tricks and tools that they can draw on to teach learners in varied ways and to teach also learners who might need different approaches.
I love that. Yeah. So not really just belonging to one camp or one band, as you mentioned, by actually choosing to belong to each of the bands appropriately, right? So when this band is needed, you actually belong to it, and when that one, you actually choose to belong to that band. What's actually very interesting about grammar teaching, especially in those, let's say, old days where grammar was taught explicitly but nothing followed, is that it tends to be tied to a phenomenon called a language learning anxiety or foreign language anxiety. And I know that you have done a lot of research on that. So is there anything that you would, what does research actually say about the role of stress and actually anxiety-provoking instruments or tools in the language classroom?
It's a very, very well-researched topic, and it's been around since the 80s, and I have, in the last few years, started doing a lot more research on that as well, but from slightly different angles that haven't been explored yet. I think it's normal that students will be anxious to some extent, especially when they have to speak in front of others. I think it's the role of the teacher to some extent create a safe environment where the anxiety is minimized or it's tolerable. I know that's very difficult when you have 30 students in a classroom.
Yeah.
But what I would also want to say to teachers is that it's not always possible to eliminate it. So one of the things that I'm researching at the moment, I'm looking to what extent individual differences that people carry with them, like their personality, their propensity towards anxiety, general anxiety, and some other factors, to what extent they predict whether somebody will be a very anxious learner or not. And that, of course, means that some of those differences are genetic, some are something that the learner brings to the table and are not necessarily easily changed or should be changed by the teacher. But it can help us maybe predict which of our learners might be particularly susceptible to this type of anxiety, and that we can then help them with it. And as you say, like, some learners might actually find a little bit of anxiety a good motivator. But I think as teachers, we do need to be able to kind of recognize which students thrive with anxiety and which students are actually so anxious that they can't participate at all. And, there are usually little things that we can do to make that better. But if we don't know, or if we are not even aware of it or able to recognize this in our students, then it might be a bit more difficult to actually help them.
Yeah, completely agreed, because there are a lot of students who actually are not really anxious. They're just maybe afraid of how you will react to a question, or so that actually brings me to maybe a provoking question, kind of thought-provoking in a sense. So is there really a thing as specific as foreign language anxiety? Would you say that an anxious student is actually kind of prone to be anxious in math, in language learning, in, I don't know, astronomy, whatever? So is there a thing that we can actually call specifically foreign language anxiety?
I think there is.
Okay.
So, for example, now I've done a study with about over 300 Croatian high school students, okay, where we measured their personality, we measured their tendency to be perfectionistic.
Okay.
We measured foreign language anxiety and 2 other types of more kind of general anxiety. And it is possible, foreign language anxiety is considered to be a situation-specific anxiety, which means it occurs only in very specific situations. So therefore, I do think that it's possible for students to maybe not generally be that anxious, but be very anxious in certain situations around foreign language learning. And this is mostly around speaking, around participating, around communicating with others. There's a lot of a component is, fear of judgment, fear of shame. And I have seen such students in my own teaching career as adults, actually, because I mostly worked with adults, who would be perfectly normal if I met them on the street, but the moment they enter in my classroom, they would shake and they couldn't speak. And, again, but the thing with the foreign language anxiety is that unless it's really, if a person does not have sort of other huge anxiety issues in other domains of their life, but if this is really more apparent just in foreign language anxiety, it is usually through reassurance and a good relationship with the teacher that the student can gain confidence. And we also find that the more proficient students are lower in foreign language anxiety, which means, again, once they get the confidence and the proficiency to express themselves, they stop being that anxious. But in our, over 300 students, we very clearly see students who score very highly on foreign language anxiety scales. Unfortunately, I had a few students who scored very highly on the generalized anxiety disorder scale as well. Unfortunately, the study is anonymous because I wish I could have gone back and warned somebody that, there's at least 4 or 5 children in there who seem to meet the clinical threshold for anxiety. But, I haven't finished data analysis, so I can't tell you yet whether there is a relationship between foreign language anxiety and those who score highly on other anxiety measures. That's still to be determined, but yeah, there probably will be.
Okay, so you actually answered a part of my next question, but I will ask it anyway. Considering the fact that individual differences should be catered to, right, in any classroom, especially the language classroom, and knowing that is not very possible or is not always possible where there are, 20, 30, or even more students in the classroom. What can a teacher really do in a classroom where there are, let's say, more students who show some traits of language anxiety? So,
first of all,
recommendations.
It's a really difficult and complex question. First of all, I will say that it's not the teacher's responsibility primarily to do all of that, especially not in the current circumstances. I think we need more funding across the world. It's the same thing in the UK, although it's the 6th largest economy in the world. Schools are not funded enough. There is not enough teachers. Teacher burnout is high. Teachers leaving the profession is very high. So what I would first want is for teachers to be given proper resources and support to be able to help students. So that will be the primary, because I don't want it to be the teachers should not have all of this on their shoulder.
Yeah.
But in terms of teachers do have a responsibility to make a safe classroom and to have a good relationship with students, in the sense that the students trust the teacher, and from that trust, then they gain confidence and encouragement to participate in the lesson. And I think part of that is, I know, again, that's constrained by the curriculum.
Yeah.
And the curriculum is very focused on testing, and I am aware of all of that. And I have some experience working in secondary schools, but nevertheless, there are things that teachers can do to make language learning less boring, to make it less about tests, to make it more about speaking and using the language. And by fostering that, they will also give their students more confidence, which again, in turn, lowers the anxiety. So yeah, I think, how you teach. And I think we can all look back. I can even look back to my own secondary school, and you had language teachers which were insanely boring, and you learned nothing apart from how to do a test. Yeah. And you had language teachers that, with the same constraints, were able to make the lesson fun and engaging, and that you got something more out of it than just test performance. So in that sense, I think teachers have a responsibility to do just that.
And also one very clever thing you mentioned, so sticking to, let's say, so having your students interested, focused, involved, makes them confident in, okay, so this is something that I'm not necessarily good at, but this is something that I know something about, that I actually feel confident enough to share, right? So you need to be close enough to them, you need to be close enough to what they actually want to hear and what they are interested in. Yeah, and not just that, even maybe the simplest thing, being able to understand what they're actually supposed to do. I myself, as a teacher, sometimes find how anxiety provoking a simple instance of not understanding the instruction. So if they're not able to follow what they're supposed to do, the very aspect of them becoming engaged or even being willing to say or do anything comes maybe to nothing, right?
Yeah.
So the simple thing, so making sure that they know in some very simple terms, in very simple language, being able to follow what they are supposed to do. And from part of the teacher, making sure to plan in advance that your students will be able to easily engage with the task. Because the more confident students, in my opinion, they actually find the very fact that that they did not actually understand some kind of instruction, like, okay, a challenge. Let me see if I actually understood this. But the slower ones, the ones who struggle, they do not even have not even the will to engage, but not even the will to actually ask a question, because they automatically see themselves as the one who is probably the one who will not get what they're supposed to do, right? So it comes from the very mere aspect of becoming engaged with the task itself.
I completely agree with you, yeah. But I think also, like, this goes hand in hand with the kind of creating a safe classroom where the student feels like they can ask for clarification as well and be honest with you without the fear of being ridiculed or thought of as less. But there was just one more thing I really wanted to say. They're the minority, but there will be students who genuinely struggle with anxiety, whether it's foreign language anxiety, whether this is coupled with general anxiety in there. And I think because they, as a result, very often become withdrawn, even with the best teachers, you know, we're all human. Sometimes there is a kind of tendency to just either leave them alone because it's easier, or to just assume that they're lazy and uninterested. And I would say when you have students like that, always check whether there's something deeper going on. And it may not be something that you can fix, but you can alert somebody else, hopefully, who may be actually able to support them better. Because as we see from my data, you know, there were at least 5 or 6 students who were under serious pressure, and I did wonder about them. Of course, I don't know who they are, but I did wonder about them, you know, and what it's like for them in the classroom, and, you know, whether they are even noticed as really struggling.
Okay, so maybe another topic to open up here, and that is student autonomy. So that has actually become like a buzzword all over the education world, let's say, not just language teaching. So when we talk about student autonomy, okay, we actually often do, but when it comes to language learning, do students really know what's best for them? And do teachers still need to take control? I mean, there is, I think, a lot of research about incidental learning, about students who actually engage in language learning outside of the classroom, that they actually need less assistance from their teacher, that they're much more autonomous than the students who actually do not engage with language outside of the classroom. So where do we go from here? We know that there is a lot of exposure. We don't know how much exposure our students are actually taking in, so we don't actually have some kind of a, you know, I don't know, recorder that will tell us this one spent 5 hours on YouTube and this one does not actually get exposure at all, right? So how do we actually take the best of what our students learn outside of the classroom?
Well, again, I think it's like with the explicit grammar teaching versus input-driven. It's not one or the other. It's both together. I mean, I still firmly believe that the teacher needs to be in control, because this is a school setting, and generally teachers are there because they have certain amount of knowledge that the child simply does not possess, right? So I think it would be very silly in a way to deprive teachers of that position, and I don't think it will be to the benefit of the students at all. However, I do agree with you, and we're coming back to this idea of individual differences, that not all learners are the same, and not every learner needs exactly the same approach. So there needs to be some consistency in the approach, but there also should be some flexibility to deviate from that kind of central approach to the benefit of the student. But my question goes back again to what we previously discussed. Do teachers actually have enough resources and training to do that? I think it's great to say what teachers should be doing, but the more important question is, can they do it, right? You know, in 45 minutes or 60 minutes of a lesson, do they actually have enough time, in addition to a very packed curriculum, to cater to students' individual differences to that extent? And that's, I'm not convinced that they do.
I would agree, absolutely. I just wanted, before I go back to this issue, I would just like to ask you about how you feel about making groups from the very beginning. So there are some countries like Poland, let's say, who started actually making or separating students into groups from grade 1, right? In order to, let's say, give them the best possible education that they can get. So the students who have learned English prior to attending school are given a chance to actually continue their language and education in one group, and the students who actually haven't had this privilege, let's say, because all of the private schools before attending formal education are private schools in a sense that they're actually paid, right? You actually have to pay for your child to be able to learn English. So they are given a chance to learn with the others who haven't actually had instruction in English. Is that a privilege? Is that wrong? Is that right? So how do you see it?
The same thing exists in the UK as well. It's called SETS, and it exists for English, not foreign language, but English and maths. And there are 3 sets, sort of low, medium, high, and then depending on your scores, you are put into each of those sets, and then the curriculum is adjusted to your level. I teach about that every year at university as well, as part of one of my modules, and I actually think it's an absolutely horrible idea. You can argue that then, you know, the kids are taught at their level, but generally from my experience with UK education, and I did do some teaching in UK secondary schools as well, sort of from age 12 onwards, there is very little opportunity for set jumping. So once you're in one set, you're in that one set. That usually psychologically messes with children. It also it also kind of plays out a concept called self-fulfilling prophecy, where if children are told that they can't do something, then they will start believing that they can't do something, even though they actually might have the ability to do something. I think it also deprives the group of students to be taught about cooperation, about helping each other, about patience. So I think maybe for some kids, this ends up having an academic advantage, but I feel that for the majority of the kids, the academic advantage is, or even if there is an academic advantage, it's minuscule compared to the psychological damage to the children.
So that's quite interesting, because I don't know if that will actually also happen to Croatia, because there is some kind of new law on gifted individuals who will be probably given a chance to actually spend more time in a group with those students who pass the same test with the same.
Sorry, that's different. Yeah. Gifted individuals are very different.
Yeah.
And gifted individuals are usually, they're first of all a very small minority.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of research that shows that because of their giftedness, because overall they have a genius IQ generally, that's one of the kind of cutoff points for how we assess their giftedness. They do need additional occupation in school, and they need additional challenges. But it is very different to SETS. And again, gifted learners are a very small minority. And, you know, I agree, schools should be able to, they need to be able to cater to both gifted individuals and disadvantaged individuals. But, like, the concept of SETS still wouldn't be enough for a gifted individual, if that makes sense. They would still need something more.
They would still need additional activities. To be quite honest, I have nothing against additional activities. I think that most of us, even as adults, so we need to spend time doing things that we are actually good at, that we're prone to do, and that actually we have some sort of a talent or a knack for. I have nothing against that, but actually it's a kind of a jail, right? So you don't really choose to be there, but it's as if you actually have to be in a group with, let's say, 5 other students who were just like you. Maybe young children should not be maybe pushed into groups of that sort. Additional activities are completely different, as I said. So they are not that much time-bound, and they actually give you a chance to develop, right, so your talents. But I would like us to, so this is actually a very, I would say, interesting topic for both of us, but we have so much more to actually cover. And I would like us to go back to one thing that you have already explained throughout our talk so far, and that is the future of language teacher education. So my question is, if you had to redesign, and you had the power and the privilege to redesign teacher training programs from scratch, what would your top 3 priorities be in order to better prepare teachers for today's classrooms, and not just language classrooms, but classrooms, right?
Well, that's a very big and complex question. I'm not sure I can isolate it to 3, but
okay.
One thing that I've definitely observed, so having been trained as a teacher myself at Zagreb, I would say that we had a lot of emphasis on knowledge and theory and comparatively less ability to put this into practice before we went on the job. In the UK, because I'm within the Department of Education and we also educate future teachers, I've seen the opposite, because a lot of their training they're given is very practice focused.
Yeah.
But I think there's not enough theory and understanding and knowledge about how the mind works, how the mind learns, how language is structured. Those are, you can't teach those things unless you have a deeper understanding of how, language works in the mind. So I would say that so far these 2 countries, and I would say probably the majority of countries in Europe, fall within one of those 2 categories, either too much theory, not enough practice, or too much practice, not enough theory. So I would kind of ideally dial all of that to the middle, have a course, have a degree that whatever is learned in theory is then systematically put into practice.
So more practice compared to the way that Croatian language teachers are educated, and more theory in compared to how the UK future language teachers are educated.
I think you need a symbiosis of both.
Yeah.
Like you need a merger of both to actually be prepared for the job. Because if you have a lot of theory, then on the job you are learning all the tricks and, gaining confidence and all of that. And that's, for me, it's still a preferable to what the UK does, where you have so much experience and it's great, but then, where do you get the knowledge from when you want it? The tricks of the trade you will get eventually from teaching, as long as you do it long enough. But the knowledge, if it hasn't been given to you, or at least the knowledge where to find knowledge, no amount of experience is going to give that to you.
I completely agree. There are a lot of colleagues of mine who usually say, well, I have been doing this for 20 years. Who would be better at this than me, right? And that can be the most misguided way of thinking, I know, because just because you have been practicing something for 20 years does not actually say a lot about how well you have actually done the job. Okay, so how much, in your opinion, practice is enough, and how much theory is enough, and how much practice is, let's say, too much, and how much theory is too much?
I mean, I can't answer that because, I would need to sit down and look at the number of hours and the number of modules and all of that. I just think, I think the problem is that those 2 things are very often taught in isolation from each other. I think once you learn something, it's not like, for example, in Croatia, you get practice after 2 years of into your degree, 3.
No,
4. No, yeah, 4. Sorry, it's been a while. So there is a tremendous amount of knowledge already that's kind of escaped your head by the time you get to the practice. So if you had more integrated practice from year 1 throughout to kind of be able to practice what you've just learned, or to not even, I'm not saying in year 1 you need to go and stand in front of 30 students and teach, but at least be in the classroom and be able to observe the theory in practice. I think that would be absolutely invaluable. So integrate, as 2 best buddies, theory and practice from the start.
Would you say that applied linguistics, considering the fact that you have a PhD in this field, do you say that theory and practice are good friends? That they are trying to be good friends, or that they're not trying to be good friends at all? Because sometimes, to be quite honest, going from teaching to academia back to teaching, the difference between how academia or, let's say, applied linguistics research treats teaching to an extent can be really depressing. There are not a lot of research who can actually clearly or openly state or instruct teachers into what their job actually should be. And I'm not saying that teachers should in fact read research in a sense that, okay, so I will now read this article and I will know exactly what to do. I don't think that there could be such a body of research that could answer all of the questions that emerge through teaching. But still, in my opinion, there is not as many research that actually strives to give very clear effects of, let's say, or that is even interested, let's say, in such ways to prove the effects of certain teaching methods on students' results. I'm just curious about how you see how.
I think generally I would completely agree with you that there is a lot of research going on and very little trickles down to teachers. Some of it should trickle down. Some of it is not really necessary. I think applied linguistics is a very wide field, and I think it's kind of more broadly divided into people like myself who research language not to improve teaching. I personally, especially with my grammar stuff, I've never researched grammar because I'm trying to improve teaching. I research grammar because I'm trying to understand what is happening in the brain of people when they learn grammar. By default, my findings will have implications for teaching, but the primary goal is not teaching. And then you do have a lot of research out there of people who are doing research on teaching practices, who are trying to directly improve teaching practices, but even that is still not trickling down the way it should be. And I think there are several reasons for it. One is that it's not available in a teacher-friendly format. And to that, I don't know if you're aware, but there is a repository from the University of York called OASIS, where people summarize. So when you publish a study, you summarize your study in layman terms and upload it to OASIS, where teachers can access it for free. So maybe that, I don't know if you can put any links with your podcast, but that would be a good link to put in. But this also assumes a responsibility on the part of the teacher to actually engage with recent literature to improve their own teaching practice. And again, this brings me back to how underfunded education is and how tired teachers are. And unless we change that, at least to some extent, I don't think teachers are going to become any more motivated to be reading research papers in their own time.
Yeah.
But as a third kind of aspect to this, I think schools need to take responsibility for educating, for continuous education of their teachers. And not just education to tick a box that is extremely boring and irrelevant to teacher, and it feels like 3 years of your life just went down the drain, but actually bringing meaningful speakers who can, in a meaningful way, relate to teachers of, what's the latest in research, what's the latest, in teaching practice, how can we improve it, how can we develop as individuals who then go into the classroom. So I think you need all three strands really for successful teacher education. Continuous education.
Yeah, agreed. I think you mentioned really crucial things. So the fact that a lot of not every teacher is, up for reading research, and that is not actually something to be, ashamed of, or maybe to avoid admitting, okay, so I got my degree, I know how to do my job. The problem is that teaching is a very complex profession, and having students who actually, year by year, you can actually see them outgrowing what you know. Now, you actually must hit a wall somewhere, somehow, in a sense. Oh God, so I need to be able to face them. So I need to be able to actually give them what they need, and I need to keep up with what they know. So I think that every teacher actually always comes to a point where they see that they cannot really stay where they are. I think that, in a sense, it goes without saying. So you would not actually become a teacher anyway without being aware of the fact that you actually have to continue learning. The problem is that maybe the research that is actually supposed to inform teachers sometimes, well, I will actually use the term, although I'm quite aware that it's not an easy one, so sometimes fails the teachers.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, hence why OASIS was formed precisely to bridge the gap between, boring, long technical research papers and, information that is relevant to teachers. And that's why it exists. But it's only a small step, more obviously needs to be done. It's just, again, in the culture of overwork, underfunding and burnout, I sometimes do wonder how much we can realistically expect.
And I would just like to bring us back to one final topic, and that is the topic of mental health in academia. I would be it would be a shame for us not to open this topic, because you are one of those people who actually openly discusses mental health, especially in, a context like as specific as academia. So can you give us kind of a short overview of your work in that field? I know that you have not done any research there, but I'm just curious about how you came to actually openly discuss this, and yeah.
So it came out of necessity, because I think now looking back, when I started my PhD in 2013, there was no research on this, but by 2019 there were already quite a few studies which showed that PhD students have quite appalling mental health. The PhD experience itself, it's very isolating, it's very unstructured, it has so many problems, and a lot of people end up suffering with very poor mental health during the PhD. And they may have been fine before, they may go to being fine after, but the PhD in general is not any easy thing mentally. So that happened to me as well, and because I don't know how to keep my mouth shut, I just kept talking about it. And in talking about it to my colleagues, I realized there were actually a lot of people who were the same, except they felt like they had to keep quiet about it. Kind of me speaking out encouraged them. And as a result, during my PhD, departments would ask me to deliver talks on these topics to their PhD students. So I did that quite a lot. And then when I continued as an assistant professor at the university, I started to explore as well how these mental health issues relate to not just PhD students, but academic staff, and found out that as a group, we have a high propensity towards perfectionism and depression and anxiety. So now I do a very similar thing. I mean, I have a blog where I write about my experiences of mental health in academia, and I give talks. So I go again around departments, and it's either early career researchers or it's more general, but I talk about what is mental health? Why so many of us are affected by poor mental health in academia? So what is it specifically about the structure of academia that can make people unwell? And then also how to take care of yourself in this kind of climate. So I don't know if that answers your question, but...
Absolutely it does. I think I would say that that's very brave. It's very brave, actually, to open subjects like that, where you also explained it well by saying it was not until I actually started talking that I actually heard that I was not the only one. But you could have also faced maybe a wall, in a sense that, okay, so this is the thing that is obviously happening to me, but I might actually find out that I am the only one, right? It didn't. Yeah. Of course it didn't. It's still actually very brave to, open up to people like that, especially in an as I already explained, a specific context like the academic one, because we are mostly expected to do all of the work, not get too much attention, not get too much help.
Mm-hmm.
And in the process, yes, it's very easy to lose your way. Luckily, we have people like you who are always, up for a challenge. And like you said, you could not keep your mouth shut. So I hope that you will actually stay that way in the future too. So we can learn a lot of new things from you. And we're looking forward to your research. I will make sure to mention everything, so every detail that we discussed about in the show notes as well. And I will actually give a reference or two to your research and to your PhD, so our listeners might also read it and have a look at how they could actually.
Can I just say, don't read my PhD?
Yeah, why not? Yeah, I know.
It's too long and boring, and I have since published a paper from it, so you can just read the paper. It's a summary.
Sure. Maybe your PhD will actually inspire a researcher like you were once one as a young teacher who was actually ready to follow her researcher from Croatia to York. So they might actually follow you to York. You don't know. Okay, so for now, I would like to thank you. I hope you enjoyed our talk, and I hope that we might actually have you as our guest again in the future.
That would be awesome. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Such interesting topics. Thank you for thinking of me for this episode. And yeah, anytime you need somebody to talk about the topic, I'll always be a very happy guest.
Talking to Jelena brought me back to one of the most important and profound ideas, that teachers should and must pull their ideas from their students, their classrooms, and their daily work. Language teaching isn't about applying theory in vacuum. It's about making theory live through practice. And once again, it's clear that second language acquisition research still has a long way to go in building strong, usable connections between theory and the real world of teaching. Thanks for joining us for this episode. If it sparked new questions or reminded you what you teach or why you teach the way you do, share it with a colleague. You're not just listening, you're part of the fifth element. Hello, and welcome to The Fifth Element, a podcast for language educators who are curious, reflective, and eager to bridge the gap between classroom practice and what research tells us about language learning. My name is Jasenka, and I'll be your host on this journey through ideas that shape the future of language education. If you're someone who enjoys geeking out over pedagogy, exploring new teaching methods, or just wondering why we do what we do in the language classroom, you're in the right place. So, what is the fifth element? Well, for years, language teaching has revolved around the four core skills: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. But we believe there's something more, a space for reflection, theory, community, and transformation. That's the fifth element. In each episode, we'll sit down with leading researchers, innovative teachers, and thought leaders in language education. We'll talk about the real stuff, from curriculum design and second language acquisition to inclusion assessment and the challenges of everyday classroom life. We'll ask the not so very hard questions. How explicit should grammar instruction be? Is task-based language teaching just a buzzword or a game changer? And what can research really offer to teachers who are just trying to get through Tuesday? Most of all, this podcast is about building a community, a space for thoughtful conversation, critical questions, and a little bit of inspiration. So whether you're a new teacher, a seasoned practitioner, a graduate student, or just someone who believes in the power of language education, we're glad you're here. This is the fifth element, and we're just getting started, so let's talk.